You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Saw the games,
physical basketball
and I was at the games.
versus
You were
physical
not.
fouling.
You watched them on YouTube.
Anyway.
I saw the games. I watched the games.
Well, we're here. I'm Bob Motes. Welcome to X's and Joe's, a podcast dedicated to decoding the winning formula in college basketball.
And I'm Mike Weemuth. Welcome you to episode 13, College Basketball History. Does a school's past really matter? Recorded on the afternoon of July 10th, 2024. So, Robert, we recently had a very rare face-to-face interaction about 10 days ago.
You know, welcome. Well, I guess it was welcome back to Indiana, and glad you got back to Philadelphia in one piece, my man. Always a good time. Always good to get the kids together. Noah seems like he's doing quite well these days, and
Beth Bennett looking great.
Yeah, I think he was a little more vocal than the last time you saw him.
That was a year ago. He was
about a year ago. Yeah, he's coming along. And those of you who watched the little video we did out on the corner of 7th and Kirkwood, we'll see Mike had squirming around there. And Mike got a chance to meet one of my coworkers while he was there, as Beth and I and he were walking back with the kids. Exactly.
And I hear congratulations are in order. Congrats on your new grandchild.
It's remarkable. Oh man, bad. I felt bad for her because obviously it's like I thought everybody knew, but it's like no, not everybody knows. It's like I guess you look at me, you're thinking this guy's got a toddler. Oh.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think you and our pal Cogswell, are like the Mick Jagger and Ronnie Wood of our extended friend group. So you guys are still pushing out children at your stage of decrepitude. So
yeah, but yeah, he really does kind of keep me on my toes. Like I've learned to have to get up off the floor, and at 49, getting up off the floor seems like it shouldn't be a big deal. For those of you who are at this level, you know what I mean. For those of you who are aspiring to it, be warned. It seems like it's an easy thing to do, but it ain't as much fun as it used to be.
Yeah.
So there's always the Mike Weemuth trip back to Indiana, which I always see as kind of a precursor to another part of the college basketball calendar, which is the beginning of the shoe tournament circuits, or the shoe circuit tournaments.
Yeah.
Adidas is going on right now in the Charlotte area. I know Peach Jam's coming up as well, kind of in those areas.
Yeah. That's
kind of an exciting time for high school recruiting.
Yeah. Yeah. The summer to me, that's always when you get the most movement due to the exposure that kids are getting, against higher competition. Like they're either balling out or they're getting exposed completely by by the kids that they've maybe never played against before in high school. So yeah, it is interesting. It's like I enjoy it just because it's neat to follow. And I will say on that latter point that when you get people asking you, it's like, why isn't my school offered kid X, Y, or Z? And oftentimes, majority of the time, you say, well, they haven't really been exposed yet to Power 5 level kids yet because they haven't really done a lot in the summer circuit. Wait until then, and then you'll see how they perform, and maybe, hey, they'll get the offers you're expecting or not. So it's a little bit like our friend Sam Story always talks about, is that, the rankings obviously change a lot during that period of time because kids ball out, suddenly Duke, Kentucky, and everyone's like offering. And also, obviously, the rankers are seeing the same thing as the coaches are.
Right.
But on the downside is that some of those kids find out very quickly that, maybe Pittsburgh is not exactly going to offer me. Maybe Duquesne is actually the better option for me.
And you think about the raw number of kids who play in these tournaments, there's only so many spots that go to high major contending programs.
Yeah.
And there's a lot that sit in the mid-major, low major. And even at that point, if you're at certain levels of D1, you're looking at NAIA programs or D2 programs that might be stepping into that might be a better offer to go here than it would be to go there.
Yeah.
And so for a lot of kids who are sophomores rising to be juniors, and especially those juniors rising to be seniors, it's getting close to not just deciding a school time, but for some of them, it's a matter of which path do they want to take in the game. Do they want to ride the bench for a year or two?
Yeah.
And again, as we've talked about frequently on the show and throughout the whole back home network, between the transfer portal and NIL now, if you go, let's say you decide to go to University of Indianapolis for a couple of years versus IUPUI, and you start and you kind of catch fire, and Indiana State may be calling you at some point. USI may be calling you, and then you play 1 year there, and all of a sudden, there you are. So
the roads to Power Five scholarships are much more varied now, and sometimes it does start at a much lower position. So that is a reality. I think that fans and and just people who observe this stuff need to be more aware of.
So keep your eyes on your favorite, whether it's Pigs, Inside the Hall, whether you're hanging on Trilly, all three, none of the above. Now's a good time for you to be checking out what's going on. Just keeping your eyes and your ears to the ground as to who's moving and who's not.
Exactly. Yeah. I always used to joke the shoe circuit season. I always used to call that, AKA the proof test on which schools invested in air conditioning during their arena's construction planning. Because obviously not all schools chose that particular feature for their new home courts. So.
And I'll tell you, being in the Augusta, Georgia, Augusta, South Carolina area in summer, it's hot. I've been there. I've been there twice, both times in the summertime, and let me assure you, it's got a definite feel to it that the worst day in Indiana may be a good day there.
Exactly. You know what arena does not have air conditioning? Might surprise you.
I would love to hear it.
Syracuse. The Carrier Dome.
The Carrier Dome
have air conditioning. The most famous building in the world, named after Willis Carrier, the actual inventor of the AC system, does not actually have said AC system working at the arena. So.
I'm sure the Carrier family knows a thing or two about trying to put that in a domed arena.
I would hope so. Exactly.
So again, when we start talking about air conditioning, we start talking about the shoe circus. We also know it's back to school season, and our sponsor, Home Field Apparel, is a great place to kind of look at some back to school shopping for the young people that you might know that are looking to, maybe they're going to college or they're thinking about going to college, or even with college decision making, once they decide, a good place to start looking for certain materials for them, t-shirts, hats, and to get that unique piece that they need to complete their wardrobe. I know, Mike, you've checked out the site a couple times, and found some things.
Yeah, the two things I found that I liked, and I always kind of go back to Home Field. It's not so much they just have all the big legacy schools. It's that they have a lot of the other schools that just have been, let's say, under-resourced in terms of merchandise. They just added, I saw the North Florida Ospreys. So University of North Florida is now finally on the list for Home Field Apparel. And they seem to be adding a school every week or two. It seems like they're just another one that pops up on their radar, which is great. And I think, as time goes by, and I'm sure it's complicated, the licensing and all the other stuff you have to do with the school, but it's great. And I typically, anytime I hear someone say, oh, my daughter goes to, or my son goes to, place X or place Y, and if it's a small school, I'll immediately look on Home Field to see if their school is represented on Home Field, and I'll tell them, hey, look, that this place can actually get some of the best gear they're going to find. So the other thing I found, not just, with the small schools, the best drop, I think this last week or two, was the 1970s disco era Oklahoma Sooners gear. I think they had 9 different pieces of merchandise, shirts and hats, that were based on all the designs of the 1970s of those early Barry Switzer Oklahoma option football. All the good stuff you remember about Oklahoma at that time frame. I could literally see J.C. Watts and Billy Sims strutting around campus with that apparel. That's how authentic I thought this stuff was.
I was going to say, if you're a member of the Billy Sims Appreciation Society, it's a must buy.
Yeah, exactly.
So go ahead and
I met JC Watts once, and so.
I'm sure you did. So go to www.homefieldapparel.com to check out what they have, or download the app and take a look there. And just start thinking about what needs to be added to your fall wardrobe.
Exactly.
So when we come back, Mike and I are going to get into program histories and why it is or it isn't relevant.
All right, welcome back to X's and Joe's. I'm Mike Weemuth, joined by Coach Bob Moats. So, Bob, I know you and I have been looking forward to this one for a little while, I would say, right?
Just a bit, yeah. It's always a good one for us to get into. I know we talked about it a little bit last year in a more general way, but
yeah, exactly. And being history buffs, any chance to just crack open the history books and just go back is always going to be an automatic yes from us. So so we're definitely happy to be here for this one. So
yeah,
but I think it does have a lot of, I would say it has relevance frequently when you see a lot of conversations that take place about like a program's history, especially when you think around when a coaching change takes place. The topic comes up in bar rooms or with the talking heads, let's say at ESPN. The talking heads will say something like, "Oh, this school, they're not that kind of program anymore." And the fans, of course, get stompy footed and start shouting back, "Of course we are. We're always going to be that school." So, that debate is just constant, in college football and basketball. But, that whole conversation does raise the really interesting practical question of like, how does winning and success in the past actually functionally influence where a school falls, let's say, in the hierarchy of the present? And so like a lot of these, barstool disputes, they unfortunately tend to be framed as an either or scenario. So it's like, it's either a massive influence on a program's potential, or it's like a total nothing burger. And there's nothing in between.
So you call it like a taste grace, less filling conversation?
Exactly. Yes, totally. And, as much as I try to avoid those wishy-washy, like Deloitte consulting style answers, I can't avoid it in this case. It truly does depend. And there are some layers of nuance and particularity in this that I hope we can navigate in the next hour or so. But you and I have talked about this, enough over the last 20 plus years. So I think we can probably do it reasonably effectively.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but before we discuss, how the past influences the present, I think it's, essential to kind of look back and understand how certain schools were able to rise above, let's say, the pack, and while others were basically sort of left behind relative to those front runners. So when I think of college sports programs in that context, it's a bit hard not for me to maybe use parallels from like the business world. In business classes, they'll often talk about branding, and that's a term I think a lot of people hear and maybe don't really know exactly what it means, but it's a term that just is very prevalent in society today, unfortunately. But you hear in business school, they'll talk about branding, brand dominance, or brand differentiation is another big one. Mm-hmm. And that's basically what sports programs have. It's that they have a particular recognizability to fans and the media alike, that when you mention a school, you instantly know, okay, that school is good at this sport and that other school is good at this other sport. So just as a quick refresher, the business school terminology, a brand is a product or service that has a unique and immediately recognizable identity that distinguishes itself from the competition. So it's basically a differentiator. And when you think about that in the context outside of sports, the one I always think of is like either Kleenex or Band-Aid. Those are two names that everyone kind of knows, but those are actually company names. They're not actual object names. Like actually you have like a Kleenex right here. This is a tissue technically, but most people call it a Kleenex. But Kleenex is actually like the brand name. Actually, yeah, this one is a Kleenex, as you see. That's what market dominance looks like. especially, brand dominance. Simply mentioning an object and they mention your company's name first, almost reactively, that's when you know that you've got the market cornered. So I think you kind of see the similar advantage that some schools have in sports is very similar to this. Like you mentioned the sport, those teams are the first ones that comes to the public mind, when they're asked. So the question is for us is like, how do they get there? Like maybe the most important variable for the programs that separate themselves is just the function of time. Is that at the beginning of any new sport, there's no dominant teams, but at some point, some point of the time continuum, a few teams will start to separate themselves from the pack, the same way consumer products did, in the past as well. You think like, why did Band-Aids and Lucky Strike cigarettes have such a, cultural resonance for so long? It's because back in the olden days, when nobody had brand dominance, those are the products that are being dumped into the ration packs of every U.S. military service member overseas. So everyone knew what a Band-Aid was. So that's basically what you see for college teams. Actually, pull up a little slide here for folks to. So when I make this comparison, between, let's say, products and college sports, the thing you will often hear is sort of like first arrival advantage or first mover advantage. That's another like business term. And it's basically the same for college athletics. We'll be discussing obviously college basketball today in this particular example. But beginning at the start of any particular sport, I generically have this term called the program success cycle, which begins with some schools separating themselves from others. In this case, I actually have in my little slide here of Adolph Rupp and Branch McCracken sort of like listed here at the top. So the way the cycle works is a small set of schools are lucky enough to hire, let's say, the best coaches. And those coaches win, and they not just win. I mean, they win big. They win championships. They win NCAA titles, conference championships, etc. That success leads to a flood of fan attention and loyalty through, you might say, like the bandwagon effect. And it's important to note, like at this step in the process, how critical that advantage is. If you think about when there's no, when no team basically has, an advantage, then it's a completely open market. It's like a blank slate. Any team could technically, gain an advantage when there's no advantage to be had at that particular time. So when you think about how fan base size is pretty finite, is that there's only so many fans to go around, let's say, in a particular state. If one school gains dominance early on in a particular state, that has a lingering effect going on in 2 years later, and sometimes even decades later.
Well, and what did you also throw out, just the idea that the national market also is limited in any sport or any activity. If you're a John Wooden, for example, people follow John Wooden not just because he won big, but because of his demeanor and how he presented himself.
Right.
There was a brand inside the brand that Wooden's personal brand meshed with the values of the University of California, Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Bob Knight meshing with Indiana University, doing, and then eventually Coach K at Duke, and how those personal brands of those coaches then also pulled fans in because they play the way I like. They're playing the game the way that I like it to be played, or they are competitors, much like I'm a competitor. I feel like I have a kinship to this individual who's at the helm of a program.
Yeah. The winning kind of goes beyond just obviously the wins and losses. I mean, you're kind of winning the hearts and minds at the same time through a particular style and things like that. So it's it's kind of multivariate, I guess, when we're talking about winning.
Yeah, because and as you start talking more about money flowing in and media attention, as those guys, it's like, oh, I like their story. I'm buying his book. I'm gonna go to a lecture that he's doing on leadership, sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you think about it, the when you draw the fans in, let's say, and the fans obviously will start buying stuff. They'll buy tickets, merchandise. That leads to more money, and that attention obviously is noticed by the media as well. And so sports editors aren't dumb. They know what sells, and they will write to attract as much of an audience for themselves that they can possibly grab. And so the more the media writes about the program too, the more fans that particular team gains, and also they're able to keep those fans that they do have presently even more easily. So it's kind of this, and what you kind of notice in all of these examples is that there's almost a sort of self-catalytic quality to it, is that each step leads to like a new advantage, but then that advantage kind of feeds back into a previous advantage. And so it's always kind of like cycling, through. Mm-hmm. So it's, so yeah. And that's why, the critical point that, we're trying to make here is that the big variable is really the timing, is that, getting the jump on everyone else in a particular sport just has, a lingering effect. I've joked that if pickleball ever becomes like a big NCAA sport, if I were like an athletic director and I knew that sport was going to become huge, I would go out of my way. I would spend as much money as possible to get the best coaches, the best facilities early, because I know that making the investment now, decades later, maybe a century later, they'll say, oh, well, yes, the University of Arizona, pickleball team, yes, they were the best. And remember, they won the first national championships. And that's typically how most sports work.
True. That's Patty Paddleson, who's the Gipper of paddleball. You want him at your school. You need him at your school. I'm not in Depends yet, but when I am, sort of thing.
But just side note, but are you a pickleball player?
I'm not. I golf. We're trying to get, Beth has a paddle.
Okay.
To me, it just seems like I don't know. It just looks like a sport I can hurt myself at.
Yeah. I played a little bit of tennis in like junior high and high school, and it looks like adult ping pong to me. So
it does, and I just have a feeling that I would just be the pickleball partner nobody wants. I'd be running into my partner, and then they'd be cursing at me and rackets flying. It just wouldn't be a good thing.
Yeah, I get it.
I mitigate my damage on the golf course.
Exactly. It looks like just a hamstring injury, waiting to happen. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah. Again, the time variable is like the important thing to remember in this conversation. So yeah, the more money leads to more media attention. That leads to better facilities and resources, and we see this play out so often throughout the history of college sports. And we'll talk about later about how that does impact things even today. But you will see that how success, let's say in the 1940s and 50s for basketball programs, had a pronounced impact on the size of basketball arenas that they were able to build in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So all that stuff taken together leads to sort of like the next bubble, which is just the better recruiting. Is that once a school sort of establishes all these advantages, the money, the attention, the big fan base, the big arenas, the big facilities, then players have choices, and the best players are going to make very particular choices about where they go. And oftentimes the schools with the big arenas, the big level, the high level success, and the most media attention, those kids typically go to those kind of schools. And wants to get the better recruits, going back to all of our most every podcast on X's and Joes, we've mentioned this at least once. Once you get some better recruits, winning tends to be a lot easier. So the cycle just continues on itself. So again, it becomes this sort of like self-actualizing, self-catalytic process that you see. Not just in college basketball. It's college football. It's lacrosse. It's soccer. It's everyone.
But now, and at the same time, when you start talking about, it's also increasing your footprint. That when you really think about, when you start talking about recruiting, you can go beyond going to your backyard, basically. Once you get a national brand, and you can start competing against the big boys.
Yeah.
Think about Kansas getting Wilt Chamberlain, for example. Wilt was from there, wasn't he? Was he from Kansas? I can't remember. I know that there's one.
He's from Philly.
He was from Philly. Thank you. And Oscar Robertson from Indianapolis going to Cincinnati. When you start thinking about your program, thank you for reminding me of that, because right. So how does Fall Allen land Wilt Chamberlain? He had a national prominence and a national presence to be able to get that player to come to his institution.
Yeah.
Had Tex Winter gone out there, I'm not sure it would have been the same result as where I'm going, or Tex Winter's predecessor, whoever was there at the time.
Yeah, exactly.
So when we look at this a little more, those of you watching, you see a large bar graph up here, and you can catch it in the show notes later. But when you look at the national championships, and you kind of do it by three colors, there's looking at three eras. It's pre-1985, which 1985 was the year you had the 64-team tournament kick in. And then you go 85 to the end of the 20th century, and then you start the 21st century. You start noticing that there are some programs that are three-color programs, like North Carolina, the aforementioned Kansas, Kentucky, the aforementioned Kentucky, who during these eras found ways to continue to win at least one national title. There are, certain programs like Maryland or Baylor, Virginia. And when we look at these a little more in depth, you'll see that they've had some limited success, but not the same levels of success as other programs. So your past performance doesn't necessarily predict future results. But back to, Mike's point, where if you're a program like KU and you were, and the game was lit, your program's first basketball coach was the man who invented the game.
Yeah.
And then you continue to win national championships, whether they were Helms championships in the 1920s and 30s, which that's where Purdue gets their one title, or it was winning early national championships in the 40s and the 50s, which again was a good time to kind of think about. When you think about eras in college basketball, there was an era before the NCAAs.
True.
Where Purdue, when you look at the Purdue AAU win-loss record, a lot of Purdue's advantage was gained in the years before 1930, before Everett Dean with that IU.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah. And Purdue was like the dominant team in the early stages of the very, very early stages of the Big Ten.
Right. And when you kind of look at some of the programs, whether it's Indiana, whether it's Kentucky, whether it's Kansas, whether it's North Carolina, all of those have another thing in common, which is basketball. They're first off, they're agricultural states. Mm-hmm. So they were kind of smaller communities where when you think back to 1940, they weren't exactly near a large urban area necessarily. So you could create, and we'll talk about this a little more as we go through this, but you have these institutions that their ticket in the wintertime was the biggest ticket in town. And they weren't really what you would call football powerhouses either. Yeah. So these institutions had space in their institution for a alternative to football that kind of pushed that through. Plus, they also had, because of where they were located and because of just the nature of how high schools were, they had high school basketball programs that could feed those programs with quality players in a time before you had national recruiting, before you had what we consider today almost the international level of fame basketball has. So you have guys that kind of knew what they were doing, could put the ball through the hoop, could defend, could run things a little more effectively, and really weren't all that interested in playing football or even able to play baseball to the levels that you had in other locations. Hmm. So when you look at the national titles and you look at, you can build a program quickly. Like if you look at a Syracuse, they win their one national championship in the 2000s, the mid 2000s, but they had a couple Helms beforehand, so they have a large gap there.
Yeah.
These are programs that come up on the scale every once in a while. A program like Baylor just kind of comes out of the blue every once in a while and can win a national championship. But if you look at those programs that won multiples in this decade or in this century, you see some programs with some very rich basketball histories, including UConn. And if you look at their Final Four, the Final Fours, and we talk about the Final Fours, you start noticing that those tricolor programs have bigger, most of them have bigger or basically more proportional results. So, and that's even accounting for the fact that you don't have exact proportionality on the years that we're covering on this conversation. Duke had a couple 3 Final Fours before the 64 team tournament, including I think a national runner up.
Yeah.
Villanova had a couple. Kansas is always in the conversation. Kentucky's always in the conversation. Indiana has always been in the conversation. UCLA is always in the conversation. And so when you start thinking about, are these predicting future results? Maybe not necessarily predicting, but you can definitely see a pattern where programs with historical success can find a way to continue to replicate future success. And a lot of it's because of the built-in advantages that we were talking about earlier. We'll talk about as we're going to continue to talk about here. But in many respects, they have a positive brand, which coaches, when coaches are recruiting kids and they're talking to other coaches, it's like, well, this is a program that has a rich history, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
It kind of sells you in the door.
Yeah.
And it also, and Mike, I think we were talking about this earlier, just you and I, when we were 12 years old, we're running around in Steve Alford t-shirts,
Yeah, that's true. Or everyone had that little part that they asked their barber to cut for them.
You got the Alford part in the middle with the feathered hair back.
Yeah.
The most popular haircut in central, or really throughout the state of Indiana in the 1980s.
I remember kids specifically asking for that haircut.
For the Alford cut.
That's not a rumor.
No. And those 12-year-old boys grew up to be middle-aged men. And middle-aged men write checks to athletic departments, write checks to NIL collectives. They buy season tickets. They get their kids, and many of those kids also had dads who saw guys like Tom and Dick Van Arsdale play, and just fell in love with Indiana basketball, whether it was at the Garrett Fieldhouse or it was the Quonset Hut Fieldhouse right next to Assembly Hall, or watching the games on Channel 4. And that builds you an advantage where you have a larger potential donor base. You have a larger group of people who are willing to chip in money and their time and their love to making the program be successful. And so many times I think you and I, we've talked about this over the years, this is a conversation about not just, and we talked about this a minute ago, just the power of a personal brand being attached to a program.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, yes, it is for the kids, it's a player, but oftentimes for the adults, it's a coach.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Especially when we talk about like when the sports are in their zygote period, that, that first mover advantage is almost always the coach, right?
I mean, Newt Rockne at Notre Dame. Newt Rockne at Notre Dame.
Yeah, exactly.
They made a movie about the guy,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, back in the
40s,
just around the time when he passed away. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I've always theorized, I always run this sort of like counterfactual game, is that, what if Rockne went to Michigan State?
Right.
What if, or any of these other great coaches? Adolph Rupp graduated from the University of Missouri, I think.
He was Kansas, I think. He was, or at least he had a connection to Fog Allen.
Okay. Yeah. So there's all these potential outcomes, the alternative outcomes that you can think about and wonder, well, if this school had drawn in this coach, how much different would their results be? Or what would happen to that school, that elite school that we think of now, if they didn't get that coach? Would they just become, part of the pack? So that's always an interesting question I always ask. But I always think about that Wisconsin athletic director back in the 60s or 70s, who at the same time had invited a young Bo Schembechler and a young Bob Knight into interview for the head football and basketball coaching positions. And didn't take either of them.
Right.
and both of those guys were like, yeah, hey, I think Wisconsin's great. Madison's.
I could see Madison. I can live in Madison, and both and it's in plenty of hunting and fishing land up north of it,
Knight would have loved
Wisconsin. Knight would have loved the state of Wisconsin. He would have a lot more space to shoot and to cast rods at. Hell, he would have been able to fish he would have been able to go to the Union and just throw his line out in the middle of the day. But yeah, it's that iconic. Who do you and we talk about Mount Rushmore. I'm not a big fan of the Mount Rushmore conversation, honestly, when fans say who's on your Rushmore, because what it really does is it also oftentimes it trends early or late. Excuse me. In reality, the Rushmore conversation is okay. Who are the faces that you're going to chisel in stone that you want kids to remember for all time? And to me, it's not even a Rushmore as much as that who gets the statue out front and the name and the arena named after him. Who do you name the floor after? And I say the statue because the statue casts a shadow, because everybody that walks through those doors to work every day,
figuratively and literally,
exactly, has to walk in the shadow of this larger than life character who's screwed up just like everybody else, but is canonized almost in sainthood. And as you look at, we're talking, right now we have there's a picture up of Fog Allen. Yeah. He's almost like, it's almost like he's almost like one of the apostles, like the lead apostle of basketball. Well, he played for Naismith. He was James Naismith, and to Fog Allen, and it all branches from there. And you look at him in the 40s and the 50s with 9 conference titles, 3 Final Fours, and an NCAA, only one, but still one NCAA title. Lawrence, Kansas was and is one of the, is the cradle of college basketball. And they built, basically the program built around that persona more so than even Naismith, who's seen as more of he blesses with his presence, almost like almost a godlike type of thing. And then he belongs to the ages, but in Fog, we do no wrong. And you look at the coaching tree, that definitely shows that. So as you go past this initial part of the Rushmore conversation, we move, moving on to what does that mean for winning? And you look at the coaches in the Naismith Hall of Fame. And here, again, you see the same, if you're watching, you see the same tricolor, but there's an added green to it, which is, okay, the number of coaches. And so you look at a school like Indiana, who has Everett Dean and Bob Knight in the Hall of Fame, Purdue, Gene Cady and Piggy Lambert, UCLA, Larry Brown and John Wooden. They're all there kind of in a, between 20 and 40 conference titles and the like. When you look at a Kentucky with, Rupp, Pitino, Calipari, Joby Hall, I think Joby Hall's on that as well. Maybe I'm missing that one.
Yeah.
No, Sutton. It's Eddie Sutton. Okay. It's Eddie Sutton. Eddie Sutton gets in there. KU is, Fog Allen, Larry Brown, Bill Self's now in it. And I think there's a fourth that I'm missing somewhere in that. Roy Williams. Yeah. Carolina. Those guys that have broached the 40 mark in those conferences, are the ones over the course of their tenures. You have multiple coaches who've lived up to. In Carolina, it's Dean Smith, even though you can make a case for Frank McGuire or somebody earlier being just as good. At Indiana, even though Branch McCracken is Branch McCracken, Everett Dean goes to Stanford and it's Bob Knight. Mm-hmm. Purdue, it's always going to be Piggy Lambert, but it's also going to be, it's kind of different up there because of the Gene Cady now to Matt Painter thing. UCLA is clearly John Wooden. There are these coaches over a period of time that, become the face and the ambiance of the program. Yeah. What did you say, Mike? I mean,
become the identifier.
Right. I mean, can you, like you're saying, can you imagine a world where Bob Knight's not the coach at Indiana for almost 30 years?
Yeah.
It's really hard to do. And can you actually imagine that Indiana would be what they are today if that wasn't the case?
Yeah. Yeah. You think about it like, in Knight's case, it's funny. We're having a previous conversation with someone else about this topic just recently, but I was.
And we're going to keep having it.
Yeah, exactly. We'll be having it. Just how Knight not only was popular within the context of basketball, but he kind of broke outside of it. Is that if you ask people like, okay, who are not basketball fans, just like casual people, Like, okay, can you name, do you know Dean Smith? Can you tell us about him? Maybe basketball people obviously know it. Maybe a few sort of casuals would pick up on that, but a lot of people wouldn't really know Dean Smith. Who's that? But if you mention Bob Knight to a bunch of casuals, oh yeah, the big guy, the red sweater, the throwing the chair, all that. Like Knight, not just because obviously what he did as a basketball coach, but just like the whole persona was something that was attractive to like Dave Letterman, Jay Leno. He appeared on all sorts of like, late night network shows. How many movies did Knight get in? I mean, like Blue Chips, like Adam Sandler's Anger Management. There's like a whole 1 minute segment with Bob Knight as a cameo.
Not many coaches can say that that they were emulated by that they were watched closely. Hoosiers and Blue Chips. Bob Knight was seen as a model in some respects. They modeled him. Yeah. But I think, so it's that that transcendence also kind of fits in, and the question comes out to, like Duke, will Duke trend like Indiana has and Purdue has over the years, or will they ascend and same with UConn too, with Hurley now, as these programs continue, what happens? Are they going to continue on that upward trajectory on a year-to-year basis? And that's, again, a conversation we have in the media. And I know as we kind of go on and we think about, what those iconic coaches are, like Adolph Rupp gets some of his iconic imagery because every Sunday morning, I believe it was a Sunday mornings at 11 throughout the state of Kentucky. And remember, when Adolph Rupp's coaching, TV stations are dying for content. Yeah. You can only one station can show Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. You can only show the Sands of Iwo Jima so many times. Exactly. And that's the days early of television in the 50s, the 60s, even into the 70s, where you had local programming. Yeah. And people were obviously interested in University of Kentucky basketball, and you may not have caught every game on live broadcast. So you'd have the Coach Adolph Rupp show, and for a half hour, they would have their radio or their TV guy sitting with Coach Rupp with a bottle of RC Cola, and they would go through the, they were talking into his microphone. The boys just didn't put the ball in the bucket like they did, and could have beat Vanderbilt by 50, but were beat by about 30. And blah, 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 blah. He gave you no insight really, but I'm just here because they're paying me, and I get an RC Cola, so I get the RC Cola from this. So, and that was, but once you're on TV, you're in their home, and now you're a member of the family, and you're there, dad's drinking his coffee, watching, now it becomes this thing where you have local media. And this is where, again, like the Indianas and the Kentuckys and the Kansases and the North Carolinas have some advantages. And Indiana, especially because, Soccer Stars Indiana builds Channel 4, dying for content, and figures out how to start broadcasting live basketball games, start selling Chesty potato chips. And before you know it, no grocery store in Indiana had Chesty's potato chips after they held up the bag during the first IU broadcast.
Yeah. Do you think it was? Do you think it was kind of fitting that it was on Sunday morning, especially?
I think it is. I think a lot of it was, and I think a lot of it was people went to church earlier. Would be my guess.
That was that. I always thought that was like 9:30 ish,
right? Or right before you went, you would watch the Adolph Rupp show, that sort of thing, or you watch the Bob Knight show, or sometimes Dad may not go to church at all. It's basketball season.
Or maybe the basketball team became the secular religion for some families.
In some places throughout the areas of which we speak in the Ohio Valley, I believe that it was from, it's, you may not see in the obituary what church they belonged to, but they were an avid UK or IU fan.
Exactly. that is
love them. And so that builds in. And I think, but again, you kind of look at that over time, that points to what you're looking at right now, and what we're talking about now, what you're going to talk about with the arenas, that all of a sudden now people will make a trip.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's like you say that, you build up sort of the fan base, and at some point, the stage of, let's say, the infancy of college basketball, it's important to look at like, okay, where do they start? Like, what did the facilities even look like for these different schools? Like, where are they playing? And, and were they any different from each other? And so, running through some of the archives, I was pulling up the relative sizes of the basketball arenas for the college basketball programs. And then in this case, I pulled like for the early Big 8 conference. I think it was first like Big 6 and then became the Big 7, eventually became the Big 8. So for this one, so let's see, sorry. So the basketball arena sizes for the Big 8, Iowa State was actually number 1.
Yeah,
they played at the old Iowa Armory, and I guess just from the needs for the sake of warfare, I guess they just needed a much bigger facility for the Iowa Armory than any other facility in the state. So in the 20s, the 30s, 40s, Iowa State Cyclones had the biggest arena in the Big 8. So you had Colorado, Kansas was about 5,500. Missouri was just a little bit behind at 5,000. Oklahoma was at 5,000. I think Nebraska and K-State were a little bit smaller.
So basically a lot of them were between 3,000 to 5,000, with the exception of Iowa State, which could seat more.
And Iowa State's was almost more like a true state-owned facility that just happened to have a college basketball team playing there.
Basketball wasn't its primary purpose for the building.
Exactly. Now, when we go through the stage of success that we just talked about with Fog Allen, where Kansas has separated itself in terms of its success from the rest of the pack within the early Big 8 conference. Now, when you look forward into the 1960s and 70s and 80s, when these schools started making their first construction of a new basketball arena, now all of a sudden Kansas is the biggest arena in the conference. They're, Allen Fieldhouse is up at like 17,000 plus, and all these other schools are, that did not have nearly as much success as Kansas had, are basically between like 11 to like 13, 14,000. And you'll see that a lot. And you see a lot of that in the different conferences. About like 17,000 for that first build is kind of like the dividing line, it seems, for like, okay, it almost seems like a standard. It's like, hey, if you won several national championships, you're at 17,000 above, but if you didn't, then sorry, you need to be like, just below that.
And remember, this is a time in which, by 1980, the effects of the baby boom had already kind of dissipated. We were already starting to see not an enrollment clip, but an enrollment dip or leveling off in many institutions. But this is a time in which college enrollments were going through the roof. And REO Speedwagon is touring and wants places to play. Yeah. So if you want...
Where else are you going to put ELO?
Where else are you going to put ELO? Because the WPA IU Auditorium is a good place, but the kids may want an actual arena to watch these concerts when they're coming in to pay their $4 to Union Board, or at one time IUSG, when they had the concerts after they lost their money. This was the whole process of, okay, we have community buildings. Like when like Everett Case was able to sell North Carolina State and having a bigger facility than North Carolina because we in Raleigh host the annual North Carolina Farm Expo show, and we need a place to do the expo show.
They really held it there.
Yeah, they held it there. Yeah, back in the 40s and 50s. It's like, I've got to compete. And again, former Columbus high school basketball coach Everett Case, who went to Frankfurt and then out to NC State, knew a competitive advantage when he had one. And he's like, I'm going to get a bigger arena than that SOB over at McGuire. I'm going to get one. I'm going to get this place for me. And
I can't even imagine what the visitors' locker room was used for during the Farm Expo.
Fermenting fertilizer would be my guess. But I think as we talk about multi-utilization, and you're talking about a different era in just in life in general. But yeah, I think it's a good point, Mike, that people want to see, when you have that, people want to see these teams play up front and in person. And you're going to find a variety of different ways to use this. Because again, they're not just expenses. These are revenue generation points.
Absolutely.
You don't put 17,000 seats in a design unless you know you're going to fill 17,000 seats.
Yeah, you kind of think about it. Let's say you're at a school, let's say like Colorado basketball.
Right.
Like I'm sure the AD at Colorado would have liked to have a bigger arena, but I'm sure the people that held the purse strings kind of did their analysis and said, yeah, that's actually going to cost us money by building a bigger arena.
Right.
If you were at a place like Kansas, let's say you wanted to build a smaller arena. It's like, no, I don't want a 17,000 seat arena. I want 14,000. They would look at that and come to the exact opposite conclusion. We'd be losing money by not building a bigger arena. So a lot of this really is a demand-driven reality for these schools. It's that they built based upon what they knew that they were going to need, and basically, like you said, what they could actually fill.
So, and if we look at the Big Ten, we see a similar story, right?
The Big Ten, go back in the 40s. It seemed like everyone had a field house.
Mm-hmm.
Purdue had, Lambert field house. IU had a field house. Ohio State had a field house. Everyone had a field house except Minnesota.
They had a barn.
We should almost do a pod investigation on what were they doing at Minnesota? Like, why did they decide to build this absolute monstrosity compared to all the other
cold?
arenas?
It's cold up there.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the only thing I can figure is that they needed a place to shelter everybody from the cold. It's like,
in Minnesota, again, like Iowa State, they used to play at the Minnesota Armory.
Yeah.
So, they were another one of those schools that just kind of had a state-run facility and they just sort of borrowed it. But out of nowhere, they built Williams Arena, which I think next to Hinkle Fieldhouse was the largest basketball arena in the country at the time, especially for college. So
Butler also wanted to keep the Indiana high school state basketball championships.
Yep. Again, another demand-driven construction.
Yeah.
And so you take that and then you go through the success, especially with, let's say Bobby Knight's success at Indiana through the 70s and 80s, going back to Branch McCracken's success through the 40s and 50s during that time period. And then when you get to the construction window, let's say, which started, basically in the 50s through the 70s and 80s, when a lot of schools were starting to build their first new arena that was designed specifically for basketball. Then Indiana sort of popped up top with 17. Again, that dividing line, 17,000. They're at like 17,500, and then everyone else is just like a little bit below them. Wisconsin eventually built the Kohl Center. But that was after the early 90s. So, and the Kohl Center right parallel, I think, with Assembly Hall at 17,000.
It also needs to be expressed that these campuses were blowing out of their natural boundaries at this time. Like IU people know this to be true because all of a sudden 10th Street actually has buildings on it. Before World War II, there was nothing. That's where the physical plant was, and there wasn't much up there.
Yeah.
Campus ended at 7th. And so the field house and Memorial Stadium were on the outskirts. The problem you're into now is you need parking. So now you need to go out to the bypass if you're IU, further away from campus with Mackey, where, in those types of areas. But I think a lot of it comes down to just understanding and reading your program's demand and knowing that you want to keep, and you also know you want to keep your athletic department facilities close by so that you can kind of govern them and share resources more efficiently and effectively. So there's a lot of this. I think IU and we'll get into this in different episodes later and also different back home networks. We'll talk about this, where you just have the facilities. The need to have a different facility sometimes is driven by something other than just this. But the question is, when you're drawing it on the board, why? How is it you're going to create a fan day experience that's easy for 17,000 people to show up?
Yeah.
And that, I think, is to be a hard question too. Or In the case of Ohio State, 13,000, at the Value City.
Yeah, well, that was the St. John's Arena that they
St.
had
John's
in
Arena, okay.
1990. And then so it's almost like there's these iterations. It's like everyone kind of the first arena, which is the field house, and then there was the second iteration is like Assembly Hall,
Right.
St. John's Arena, and all of them. Some are already on their third, like the Kohl Center is the third one. Michigan State obviously joined the Big Ten a little later, but they're on their third with the Breslin Center. So,
Right.
So every school is kind of like has a different sort of, I guess, building schedule in terms of their arenas. But you're right. I mean, it is a demand driven process.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing we kind of mentioned before, and it's interesting to sort of harken back to, is just think about the media influence. And the one sort of measure I always try to look at that I thought that was at least both, I guess, influential, but also sort of like reflective of the reality of how people got sports information that day, and how certain schools may have had a certain advantage over others, from that design. In this case, I pulled numbers on the Sports Illustrated covers from 1970 to 1989. To look at, what schools were being featured on the cover and what schools weren't. And if you look at the top ones in that like 2-decade period, unsurprisingly, you have UCLA, Indiana, North Carolina, and Kentucky leading the pack in terms of their appearances on the SI cover. Now, obviously, you'd have these one-off here and there, like Kansas State would appear maybe once in a while. Oregon State, I think, was in there once for like one good player, was an All-American one year. But if you think about it, compared to today, like we're so spoiled now with things like 24/7 and all the internet options that are available to you, that you can be a fan of, let's say, one of the non-elite schools and get just about any piece of information you want about your school's program. If you're an Oregon State basketball fan, you can get a lot of good information about Oregon State basketball instantaneously through the internet. Right. That wasn't true back in the day. If you wanted to get sports information, all you really had available to you was the local newspaper. Maybe the local TV station would do an interview here and there around, basketball season.
Game highlights.
What's that?
Game highlights.
Game highlights, exactly. But once like national sports focus started to happen through things like Sports Illustrated, you start to get more fan interest. But then at the same time, people are taking out subscriptions, hoping that their program will be featured, or at least somewhere they can get some piece, little nugget about their basketball program. And I always imagine this and try to be, I guess, having some empathy for fans of these teams' rivals, and just thinking, like, if I'm a Cal fan and I put in my subscription payment to Sports Illustrated, okay, I want to see some Cal Bears information. And not only do I not get Cal Bears information, but on my coffee table is sitting an SI cover with Bill Walton on it, UCLA.
Yeah.
So not only am I not getting what I want, but my dime is now basically inadvertently helping the enemy.
Right.
And that was the reality back then. So when you think about when we talk about these advantages, these first mover advantages of these sort of like first to be elite programs, this is kind of what we're talking about, is that these schools sort of ran into, they ran across the moat bridge and sort of pulled the drawbridge out, behind them, leaving everyone else kind of on the outside. And that's kind of what the reality was, especially when you think about how the media was playing a role in this and sort of perpetuating this.
You look at, and kind of around that same area, you start seeing the first generation of national broadcasts of college basketball games. I mean, the national championship wasn't always a national network event. For a long time, it had its own, like, TV stations could pick it up as an ancillary product. And it was only the national championship, maybe other games in the tournament, maybe the Final Four. But if you're an IU graduate living in Lincoln, Nebraska, there's a good chance in 1953 you don't get the game.
Right. Exactly.
And that,
and that was just kind of like the random chance of it. It's like, I hope I get to see them play.
And then, if not, again, you're hoping to get the AP story in the local in the Lincoln newspaper afterwards. You go to this other thing though, that now when all of a sudden NBC starts running a game of the week, and then eventually it becomes CBS, right. And you start looking at who was getting those games. Well, so it's those first mover programs, or programs again like DePaul was a good example of that. Like DePaul and Notre Dame always seem to be on TV during the weekends because they had national followings to a certain degree, or they were also easy because they were also easy to get because they were close to the Chicago media market and they had the broadcast ability to do so.
Yeah.
I think.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. And it's, as we kind of close out this segment, I think the main thing in thinking about, how these programs sort of built up and sort of what the role is of the coach, obviously, and the program, because obviously, the coach kind of builds the program and the program kind of comes along with it. And then the program gets a brand that's almost independent of the coach. And so it's this interesting question of like, okay, well, which one is more important? That's probably one of the most common questions I get when people ask me about this kind of stuff. Mike, is the coach more important or is the program more important? And believe me, I've done the research and I've tried to come up with some kind of number, and it's impossible. I can't like perfectly say, oh, it's 70-30, 60-40. Boy, I will say that it is a mix. There's a symbiotic relationship. And it's
a symbiosis. Yeah, it is. Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. And the main point is that, the coach and the program they're both influential on the success of the program. And it's not an either or. It's not all the coach. It's not all the program. So I think fans always have to kind of keep in mind that it matters a little bit for both, but it's not the whole story. And you can run you can run very simple comparison tests in history to prove that. I mean, look at examples like Nick Saban and John Calipari and how their recruiting changed as they moved through the schools in their own career. Like when Saban was at Michigan State, he could get good players. Yeah. When he was to LSU, he could get really good players, like just a little bit better than they were at Michigan State. And then at Bama, he got basically whoever he wanted. And that was the difference. Again, same coach. He's just moving to a different institution. That institution gave him a little bit wider array of options just based upon, again, the facility advantages, all the other things that are related to what you get going to a different school.
And the subtlety on the differencing, which is, okay, so you have a program that's that's nationally recognized versus an occasional national contender to a perennial national contender.
Exactly. And that's a lot of the better coaches sometimes have that kind of like almost interesting stepping stone, configuration to their career. Again, with Calipari, there's like, it's great, because I was looking at like very specific examples for him. Like when he was in Memphis, he could attract the occasional like Derrick Rose like player, like the one and done kind of stud level NBA dude, but he couldn't get them consistently. It was just like, here and there he'd get them. He lost guys like J.P. Prince to Arizona. I remember Stanley Robinson. He lost him. Yeah, he wanted him badly, and he went to UConn. And then Thaddeus Young, I know he wanted that. And Young went to Georgia Tech. But we were in Lexington. He didn't lose those recruitments anymore.
Right.
He was going from getting like one Derrick Rose here and there to getting 5 Derrick Roses every year in every recruiting class.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yep. So, but before we close out this one, I did just on the Alabama side of things. I cannot pass up this opportunity. I have to tell the Joe Kine story, and I thank you for this one before, Bob. So it's the 2006 bowl season. Alabama's just fired Mike Shula, who came after they lost Dennis Franchione to Texas A&M, and he came before they fired Mike DuBose. So in that moment, Bama is like in just horrible shape. They lost like, I think 5 Iron Bowls in a row. Tennessee and Florida are kind of looking down on them. They're just, in horrible shape. And so the interim coach that Bama hired at that time was a guy named Joe Kines for one game. And ESPN pulled him aside for the halftime interview as he was running for the locker room. And let's just say it was absolutely meme worthy. I mean, Joe Kynes, he's a nice guy. He's, just like a nice, good old West Georgia boy. But I think I understood about every third word he said in that brief interview. It was like the Alabama athletic director watched that Adam Sandler film, The Waterboy, and said, "Hey, that Farmer Fran character, can we get one of those at Alabama?" I think we'll share the link in the show notes to
it's
that.
Worth
but I would highly recommend the closed captioning if that's available to you in your
It's worth a minute where you're thinking this, you can hear this guy is going, "Boys, this is a football. You're here to play football."
Exactly. It reminds me, like every like horror movie that starts that happens in the southern portion of the United States. There's always that first 3 minutes of the movie where like the out-of-towner New Yorkers arrive and they arrive at that filling station in the middle of nowhere, and there was that mysterious like station attendant with the sick basset hound that sets the ominous tone for the film. It's like, "You kids be careful up there at Throat/Lake."
Yeah,
and that's basically Joe Kynes. He was
ain't from around here.
Exactly. You always notice those guys typically had like the writers gave them some completely hideous stereotyped like full name. It would be like 3 Confederate generals like all in a row. It was like, Lee Hood Jackson,
Robert Beauregard Johnston, Smith.
Oh man. But yeah, that just shows, Alabama was in horrible shape at that time.
Yeah.
And even Alabama fans were like, "Oh man, this is just a bad look for us." But I think 7 days later they hire Nick Saban, and we all know what happens thereafter. Yeah. So it just kind of shows, I think, that these issues of branding and all that, obviously they kind of vary a lot, but there's a strange sort of durability to brands, especially if you make that right coaching hire. So
right.
So with that, on segment 2 on X's and Joes, we'll discuss how different programs have navigated the present with their brand names. Coming up right after this.
Welcome back. And we'll talk a little bit now. When we start talking about leveraging your history, there's also a situation where you can leverage others' histories. And I think when we start talking about how programs build, especially if you're not, again, those programs that were there first, you have to find ways of breaking yourself through. A good example and the other thing is also not getting yourself so stale that you drop out of the lexicon, where now all of a sudden your program has completely dilapidated. And we'll talk about the Grey Garden programs here in a little bit too. But those traditional powerhouses, when you start talking about, well, how has KU, UK, UNC in particular, how those 3 programs in particular kind of kept themselves going? And Mike kind of hit the main part, which is they kept getting the right coach. Whether it was Frank McGuire to Dean Smith, then you have, then Roy Williams. I left Guthridge and I left Doherty out for a reason, because that's the other component, I think, in so many ways. You have to reinvent yourself sometimes by saying, this guy's not working out, much like we were talking about with Mike Shula. The guy's not working out. The guy's not working out. Yeah. And the quicker a program can recognize and rectify that problem, the better chance they have of pulling through. But the big key there is, what do you need to replace a coach? You need buyout money. And so now you have to have that donor base. You have to have that media base. You have to be, if you have that type of coach, and and you have to also have to be able to be in the right conference. So we're talking, these are power conference programs. They have the ability to, okay, if we have a $10 million buyout, and again, I'm not a big fan of when you start saying a $10 million buyout. Like, that's a sum. To me, I look at it as $3.5 million over X amount of years.
Right. Yeah.
Because 10 million sounds like you got to come up with 10 million right now. 3 point.
It's not like loan sharks are waiting.
Right. It's kind of like, I got to get new gutters on the house and it's going to cost me 20 grand.
Yeah.
Maybe it will. Okay. If you're paying 20 grand for gutters, I know a guy, trust me, you're paying too much, but maybe it's 5 grand to put new gutters on the house. I'll say 5. You may have to have 5 grand up front, or if you finance it out, there's a finance, and then there's kind of that longevity, and you also get them by it's mitigated with a job, yada, yada. But you pull that trigger because you're able, let's say you hired a guy in at a 6-year, $30 million deal. Those programs that have that sort of legacy can do that faster. They can do that more effectively. So you're not trapped with a Gillespie for X amount of years.
Right.
And when it's time to make the move, you make the move. They also, I think, can lead, and I think especially in KU's case, bringing in Bill Self when they did, and then letting him just be Bill Self. And they stuck with him even though they may not have, because the fan base was behind him. And then when everything became legal, Bill Self was able to then leverage NIL. And so you look at these programs, these Anderson Cooper programs. Anderson Cooper he's a Vanderbilt, right? Isn't he a member of that illustrious family?
Lori Vanderbilt is his mother, I believe.
And Anderson Cooper could have just sat on the trust fund and let the money run out and ended up, owing a bunch of people money and being, buried with his life insurance policy. But no, he continues to reinvent himself and find ways of making himself relevant. Mm-hmm. Much like these programs do the same thing. And it requires that investment, like we were talking about with the arenas, but really now it's with NIL, and also investing enough of yourself to change how you're playing the game.
Right.
I think in so many ways, you're bringing in coaches sometimes that are, you bring in coaches who are proven in many respects. So if you're Carolina, when you brought in Roy Williams, you brought in a guy that just he needed to come home, but he had already shown he can win at a high level. Bill Self had already shown he can win at a high level. John Calipari already showed that he can win at a high level. Now, 2 of those 3 programs, it's an interesting situation now because they're in a bit of what you would call a flux, because we're pretty sure Mark Pope knows what he's doing. Continuity ball screen offense, which was the most popular offense going out of the last decade.
Yeah.
Everybody loved it, thanks to Jordan Sperber. But we all studied that empty side continuity ball screen offense out of BYU, and getting those players in that system. That's a different look than Rick Pitino's secondary break systems or Calipari's dribble drive systems, which were more high talent dependent in many respects.
Yeah, very speed dependent. Exactly.
Very speed dependent. Now Pope's going to get more speed, which you put some of those concepts with that. That's going to be very dangerous, especially if you put speed with shooting.
Yeah.
But that's a bit of a question mark of, okay, well, can they reinvent themselves again to maybe look at going this route, which may be more of a UConn route than more of a Calipari route.
Yeah.
Which I think they definitely wanted a difference. I think Hubert Davis still has a lot to prove going in through this.
Yeah. I think it's always difficult, especially, there's always that discussion about what happens after the lead coach leaves. How do you replace John Wooden? And that's always been sort of the narrative, I guess, about the assumption that the next guy's going to fail.
Right.
It's just almost like a given. It's like, oh, who's the next Gene Bartow, that you're going to hire that just fills the job for 2 or 3 years, will inevitably fail. And then you'll have to go out and hire the next person. But at least that next person will not be the person that came after the legend.
But yeah, or you have a Bill Guthridge at Carolina where it was a managed handoff.
Yeah, that was like a baton passing, truly.
And it was, you're going to hold this job for a little while until we can figure some things out, but you've earned it, Bill. And he made a couple Final Fours. Or Lou Watson at Indiana back in the 60s when McCracken hung it up. You wanted it to work, but at that time, Indiana made a change to go kind of 180 from what they had in the past on both the offensive and defensive sides of the ball. But that reinvention portion is when you make that coaching hire. And the question is, are you married to a style of play? Are you married to a way of doing business? Or and as we kind of go through these, a couple of the 3 next episodes that we're doing, and getting into that more in depth, because there's always a program like Brooking to Break Through. And I think when Mike bringing up the point of, okay, so you're sitting at home and you see that your rival's on TV all the time. It makes you mad. It pisses you off. It motivates you as a fan to do something. And so when you have a chance, when your institution has a chance to maybe, we're starting a new initiative for basketball. You may send at one time you're sending a check in for $10, or you're tuning in, or you're watching more closely, or you're buying, or you're trying to find a way to support your institution. And all of a sudden they start showing a sign of life. Like, do you think it helped Billy Donovan coming from Kentucky going to Florida and being able to say, I think we can beat Kentucky, and here's how we're going to do it. And then you go and you do it, and you do it back-to-back national championships.
Yeah, proof of concept is very important in that case.
A Nate Oates going down to Arkansas or Alabama and saying, okay, we're going to compete for the Southeastern Conference, as with Tennessee, and Arkansas swiping Calipari from Kentucky to bring that model. We'll give you what you need and more room than Kentucky gave you, which seemed like it was infinite when he was at UK, but I guess there was more space John needed to be effective. And those there are some programs that kind of look at that kind of do that temporarily. I think Florida is a good example of a temporary program. I think you can look at maybe Baylor with Scott Drew, and there'll be a question to see when he goes how that looks. I mean, Drew will have a few more years left in him, but will he be able to replicate it? That sort of thing. Yeah. Tony Bennett of Virginia, kind of the same question. Or they're going to be like a Gary Williams type situation, and he was great, but he had that one time, and he can live on that. Raleigh Massimino at Villanova is another good example of that type of situation. One could even argue Denny Crum for about a 5-year period was maybe the best coach in college basketball. Mm-hmm. Although he had and that's a program that many could see as a sleeping giant. Mm-hmm. But then you have programs that, like Duke, when they hired Coach K, or UConn when they brought in Jim Calhoun, Gonzaga when they brought in Monson and then replaced him with Few. Yeah. They break into the table. And so how do they do that? Well, oftentimes, again, they come in not just with style of play, not just getting the right types of players for them, but they also bring in kind of this thing where they win big, and then they go onto that cycle, and all of a sudden they find themselves continuously finding ways of being successful. And those programs are interesting because it kind of shows that there's blue bloods, there's new bloods, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. But there is space for a Warren Buffett. There is space for a Bill Gates. There is space for a Mark Zuckerberg.
Yeah, nouveau riche versus old riche. Right.
And maybe they don't belong to the Mayflower Society, and maybe they're and the Sons of the American Revolution.
And not a Porcellian Club, yeah.
No, maybe they're not those people, but they have been able to carve out a space at the table where they can, again, be as competitive as those other programs.
Yeah.
And did they knock somebody out? That's the other question. Does the table get bigger, or do you knock, or does it just become like, are we ever going to see UCLA again where you have 8 year, where you have just that massive run of national titles?
Yeah. I mean, you think about just from from the money standpoint, I would say it's almost infinite. From a winning standpoint, obviously it's a zero-sum game because, the winning percentage of all basketball teams is 50. It has to be mathematically, unless if it's anything other than 50, then something went wrong.
Something went wrong. Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, it's like there's those cases where, and this, again, college football is the same way. You will get these one-off, and it's often, again, coach-driven, that a school will become sort of like late elite by basically breaking into the cycle sort of like in the middle of, everyone else, being sort of like above them. I used to be a Florida State football follower back in my youth. Yeah. Bobby Bowden's the perfect example of someone like that. I mean, Florida State used to be a women's college in Florida. It was not even, it didn't even allow men. And then, he comes along and like you said, Bob, and oftentimes it is innovation. It's like a coach comes in, they don't do the old stuff. They do the new stuff, and they have to, because that's the only thing they really can leverage. And people notice them. It's like, hey, look at all those trick plays running over there. And that place looks like a fun place to go. And then suddenly gets better recruits, starts winning a little bit more, gets better recruits from that, wins a little more. So it kind of builds on itself. And so the cycle for them, like, even though they were down, they were sort of on the outside looking up at everyone else who was already like had their cycle of success going. They were able to generate it, but it takes a really special coach typically to do that.
And the right situation, because even though this coach might be special, the situation, all the planets have to line up to a certain degree. When you think about Duke, and we've talked about Duke a lot over the years, when you bring in Bilas and Amaker and that crew, that they gelled, and it could just have easily have gone south on them. Nolan Richardson getting what he had at Arkansas with Scotty Thurman, Corliss Williamson, and that crew.
Mayberry, all those guys,
all those groups that, and again, you put the innovation with those players and boom, here you go. But you also have a thing where then you got to do it again, and you got to do it again, and you got to do it again. And UConn right now is the program that's doing it. I know we talk a lot about UConn because they're doing it right now.
Yeah.
Duke did it. UConn's doing it. Villanova, we're not sure can do it again. Was Villanova a one-off after Jay Wright? We're not really sure. And I know it, it just, I know that may be a point where it gets you killed in some places in Philly if I ever said that when I'm with you. But we have that same. So that's the question of, are we down or dilapidated?
Right.
I think when people think about the blue blood programs, sometimes you forget about the Magnificent Ambersons sort of mindset.
The Booth Tarkington sort of like milieu.
There's a definite Hoosier morality play in that whole work.
Exactly.
That you have the hubris. And so when you think about some programs like City College of New York is a great example, where they just, after stuff went bad, they said, we're out. Yeah. And the city of New York basically said, we have to ban this, basically.
Yeah. And they were power back in the 40s and 50s in basketball. They were like truly one of the best programs.
And had they decided just to be like, forget the rules, forget the situation, we're okay with the mob having control of this, we're just going to let this happen.
Yeah.
I remember point shaving were the recruiting scandals of the 50s.
Yeah, that was the reason they got in trouble. Exactly.
They decided just to back out of that entirely. And that, that was a decision where they just it's kind of like, Jack Burton's father in All the King's Men. He catches his wife cheating on him and he's just, I'm done. So he goes and he becomes some sort of like sidewalk preacher, I guess. And has a guy that makes angels out of bread, as his, and he's like, it's all wickedness and terrible. And I can't think about the life I used to have. Sometimes you make the decision to just exit yourself from the game.
Yeah.
I don't want to play anymore. I'm just going to sit here and watch the wheels spin around.
Yeah.
And I think some programs that's been, I think Cal's another example of that after Pete Newell.
Yeah, exactly. They were dominant like in the late 50s, early 60s. Yeah.
Reverse action offense. He's the 1960s Olympic basketball coach, which was probably the greatest Olympic basketball team in the amateur era.
Yeah. Bob Knight was a big fan of Pete Newell.
Bob Knight and Pete Newell. Bob Knight was his chief disciple on both the offensive and defensive side. Pete and Bob developed motion offense at Bob Knight's kitchen table. I mean, they said reverse action isn't working, but we're going to try motion, this new freelance system. Yeah. Dean Smith's coming to the same conclusion in Carolina at the same time of developing his version of motion offense. And then they both compared notes, Smith and Knight.
Yeah.
Showing the tightness of this and showing that, now you're a member of this club of elite coaches with elite programs, and you're going to share ideas because everyone's getting something out of it.
Yeah.
You're not telling them all your secrets, but there's only somebody. The only person who knows how to get up to Olympus or who gets to the top of Olympus with you, if you're a god, is another god.
Yeah.
You may talk to other people trying to get there, but if you go talk to a bunch of guys that were fired before and say, is this working? They're gonna be like, get out of my house.
Yeah.
So you have a very limited peer group if you're an elite coach.
Yeah.
So that's the question of down or dilapidated. when you start thinking about those types of programs, some of these programs have chosen just to divest.
Yeah.
But there's other programs that actually have fallen down around themselves.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, some of them are almost like, you think about it as like circumstantial, like, Army and Navy used to be the most dominant college football programs in the country. They kind of pulled out almost just out of necessity because, they like, we can't recruit like Texas can. So,
No, we're not dropping our admission standards at the United States Military Academy.
Exactly. Yeah. Just for the sake of the sport. And the Ivies used to be great at sports. Harvard and Yale. I mean, look at go Google national championships in college football.
Mm-hmm.
Don't look at the bottom of the list, which is today. Look at the top. Like how many times you see Yale and Harvard in there, all over the place. And so in Princeton, won championships too. So yeah, it's just some of these things are. For some schools, it's almost like a category difference. It's like you're just in the wrong category. You're not a big state school that can support this. So, but you're right. But within the state schools, let's say, like schools that maybe haven't won as much in a while. Yeah, I've always, my theory has always been that it is very much coach driven. That, or at least let's say that's the majority of it. Sometimes there's obvious institutional barriers that are sort of like the primary thing that keeps the institution from hiring the right coach. And so that's, I've always noted that probably the chief advantage that a school has over sort of the peloton of also ran schools is if you're one of those elite schools, that's kind of where the rubber meets the road for you in terms of your advantage. It is the coaching hire. Coaches,
right.
Coaches going to look at you differently than other ones. Like I said, with the example of like Calipari and Saban, they knew that going to Alabama and Kentucky was going to change their fortunes in terms of their capacity to recruit. They knew that going there, they're going to have more resources available to them than they had at, let's say, LSU and Michigan State.
If you're Harvard, you're not bringing in John Calipari, you're bringing in Tommy Amaker,
right?
Who can be competitive, because really sports is just an enhancement of your student experience and the life on the campus, and it gives some of the alumni something to talk about other than whatever it is Harvard alums talk about.
Yeah,
running the world, and the basketball team's doing okay. How's this? How have you blown up a Fortune 500 company this week? No. How's Amaker doing? Oh, good. Yeah. It's like the old chant at Northwestern back in the 80s when they were losing was, "That's all right. That's okay. They're going to work for us someday."
Yeah.
And you may not. Again, some fan bases.
I think the Vandy kids do that too.
They do that also. It's like, okay, yeah. But even then, those institutions, I think, have taken some of those. The Stanfords, the Vandys, the Northwesterns have taken a much more aggressive stance in being more, because now their alums are like, "Hey, we can buy this stuff. Why are we not buying it? Can't you get this figured out? Yeah. So let's get a guy in here that can figure it out."
Yeah.
And whether it's Jerry Stackhouse and doesn't work out, or Chris Collins have been very successful at Northwestern. Yeah. So those are programs that, again, but then you look at pure dilapidation, and I give you DePaul.
Right. Yeah. That would be a good example.
Ray Mikan, who was probably the first really, truly national star of the game of basketball, is a DePaul grad. He's so great, they named a drill after him. The Mikan drill is still run by every youth basketball program all the way up. It's running a version of the Mikan drill.
Right.
And so it was developed for him. Ray Meyer had him. Ray Meyer for years was considered one of the best coaches, one of the best programs in the country. They never won a national championship, but they were a powerhouse independent, always on TV, maybe not, always in the national conversation. And when Ray left and his son Joey took them over the family business, things didn't go as well.
Yeah.
And now they have Holtzman up there, so clearly, they're sitting in the Big East, but last year they were a program that they would not have been competitive on some low major conferences.
I've jokingly said it would be interesting to have just a 1-game playoff between Louisville and
Oh.
Paul.
At one time in the old Metro Conference, that would have happened.
Exactly. And that would have been an absolute
And-
barn burner back in like 79, around that.
Yeah.
Era.
Oh yeah, in '79, that's a game that was a game of the week in the '70s and in 1980. That DePaul versus you can bet you'll see NBC, Dick Enberg and Al McGuire and Billy Packer doing the game.
Exactly.
But that's not what we're and that's where a program has danger is they can become dilapidated. They can become they get to, and it was and here's the other thing, it's a slow decline.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like just the bottom falls out. And I think as IU fans, this is why I wanted to have this conversation as we lead into what we're going to do with Galen in a couple of weeks, what we're going to do with Bo and a few after that, is that when we start having this conversation, and this is, that this part of it, the start of it is, it takes a while for Grey Gardens to fall apart. The raccoons don't move in the day Dad moves out.
Exactly. Yeah. The day the last investment check comes in, the full investment check. Yeah. The raccoons aren't there the next day.
The raccoons aren't there delivering it.
Exactly.
You have to give yourself a long period of time of continuously blowing yourself up, because eventually that donor base, the 50-year-old men become 70-year-old men, become 90-year-old men, and they die off.
Yeah.
And then maybe their kids aren't nearly as generous as you were.
Yeah. And you're right. It is, we talk about branding, there's a term called brand erosion. It's like the opposite of what we're talking about before. Like, building the elite brand and everyone like goes, to your product. The opposite is when people just stop going to your product. And yeah, that's what you think about, like in the college sports context. I always think about, the advantages that you have with the media in terms of the actual media members themselves. They grew up, let's say, when they remember a school like, let's say, UCLA or Indiana, even though, those teams, you could kind of put in this category of like, they're still kind of up there, or are they not? Jay Bilas remembers when Indiana was really good.
Yeah.
So when you hear him on national broadcast talking about, IU and their, all the special things he remembers about the way Indiana used to be. If you're like 20 years old today, you think, why are they still talking about that school? I haven't seen that school do that much. Well, it's because those media members, that's who was good when they were young. And that kind of was the framework of, how they understood basketball when they were in their, formative years.
I can't remember. Was Jay a senior in 1987? I think he was.
Bilas?
Yeah, Bilas. Yeah.
I thought he was 86.
Maybe it was 86, because 87 was when
was that Louisville championship game, I think.
And who came into his locker room to talk to him before the game? Bob Knight.
Yeah, that's
Bob
right.
Knight drove down from Bloomington to help Mike to talk to him. Much like 10 years earlier, he had the recordings of all those of Hank Iba and Pete Newell and Claire B going in and talking to his kids.
Yeah.
And that, I think and now the other thing I would just say is this: we're in a world where you and I are sitting here on an IU internet network talking about this. It's not a warning sign. It's what this is more or less, let's put this in perspective and know that your history does matter. It gives you built-in advantages. We're not saying this is happening tomorrow. What we're saying is there are processes to be run here. And I would argue it's never too late. And you can always go back and say your history matters and your history is a piece of who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You think about
don't run from it. Don't run from it.
Yeah.
But don't live in it. That's the other thing. Don't live in it.
Yeah. I mean, it's the difference between, you think about coaching and all that, I always ask, is the coaching and the people at the institution, are they lifting the school up, or is the school lifting them up? And there's oftentimes a difference.
And there are times where, even if you're looking at it from a historical perspective, sometimes you have to look at your history and be like, that's history. That's not our present. Let's try to find something that we can preserve our history in a different direction.
Exactly. It's like when Notre Dame went to that national championship against Alabama was several years ago.
Yeah.
And you remember just how crazy the the engagement was
Yeah.
for Notre Dame. And, I was just like online and all that, but just like, people showing up for the rallies and, merchandise purchases. And it was funny. It was like truly, Wake Up the Echoes was very true in terms of like what was happening at the cash register.
Right.
Because those Notre Dame fans that may have been dormant for all those sort of like mediocre years before then showed up again. And that is typically true of any school that has a very strong following.
Look at Purdue.
Yeah.
Purdue this year, same thing. It was like, oh no, they're alive. I mean, I'm going to my basement with canned goods. You don't think in Columbus, Indiana, I'm not an IU target? Trust me. I'm flying the flag out front. Even if they don't know me from anything else, just know me from coming up on the street. Here's a guy that always stands up and claps on the fight song.
Precisely.
I mean, if they go rabid, I'm there. I'm on that public enemy list.
Exactly. And typically, the longer the wait,
the worse, the more
bigger the explosion of happiness happens within the fan base, and
just
they
like
buy
Indiana,
more than they would if they had just been the championship, 5-10 years before.
Just like Indiana State going to the NIT, same thing. It was the same phenomena. It was party like it was 1979 all over again in both programs.
Truly.
So again, hint of things to come. But when we come back, we're going to kind of talk a little bit about what one of those other great things that stirs our emotions whenever we hear it coming on. Back on X's and Joe's.
Welcome back to X's and Joe's. I'm Mike Weemuth, joined by Coach Bob Motes. Yeah, Bob, as we were preparing this show, I was drawn to one of my odd little side interests in college sports, which is, the game day traditions, be it college football or college basketball. That would be like, the chants, fight songs, rituals that serve as those, we're talking about branding, like stark identifiers for each school's brand. And I haven't put this on the list yet, but I think that maybe someday down the road, this could be, if we're running really low on content, we could do one show on just all of that stuff, all the mascots, the songs, because I truly think I could fill a good 2 hours with it. So.
Oh, Auburn still bugs the hell out of me. Auburn's the one that gets me every time.
Exactly.
And a lot of it, and again, sorry, John, but when you were doing the false Auburn chat back in the early 2000s, I hear it in your voice.
He used to do that War Eagle, didn't he? I remember
the War Eagle chant is like,
he worked with someone at a campaign. I think that was
work, and he would just do that, and I'm like, oh shoot, he goes again. Get out of my head.
Yeah, but those are those like great sort of like variances, those earworms versus those like greatest hits of like college bands that that you and I both love for different reasons, right?
I mean, my dad was a music major. He was a band director and high school band director for a couple of years. He got his degree in music education from Indiana State University back in the 60s and 70s when Jim Church was the marching director at Indiana State. Mm-hmm. So if you're the one person who might have been a bandy, you might know what that meant to those guys at that time. But I always find it interesting because origins of music kill me sometimes. We talk about fight songs. Mm-hmm. A lot of them were written in a time in which John Philip Sousa was
that Edwardian era of like 1910, 1920s.
Jazz is just starting. So James Joyce Europe and some others are beginning to use brass bands. The World War I kids are coming. So marches and
Barnum and Bailey B-side kind of stuff.
Right. And you go even a step further and you start looking at it, looking at Tin Pan Alley songs. Right. But then you have a whole other generation when country music starts getting recorded. And I mean, like you think about Rocky Top and you would think, well, man, they must have been playing that at the University of Tennessee since the inception. Yeah. But no, the song was released like in 1968.
Yeah,
it was composed
Christmas of 1967. I remember that because I've heard the YouTube that they play that, and Sonny Osborne always mentions that. This is released Christmas of 67.
I mean, after the Andy Griffith show, after Andy was close to leaving the show, because that was where a lot of America first got their first taste of bluegrass music, was the Andy Griffith show, followed by the Beverly Hillbillies.
Truly, yeah.
And now it's right there. It's iconic. Or if you think about my father playing the Wabash Cannonball, my father never enjoyed a piece of country music in his life, found it to be a completely just like ear
I
bleeding.
remember the ISU band playing the Wabash Cannonball constantly at the Holman Center. So yes,
I mean,
that's no
I
lie.
could just see him trying to get that through that on 220 beats a minute just because I can't do this anymore. Knowing what it is. K-State uses it too, by the way.
They do, yeah. They're the Power Five school. I think that they're kind of associated with that. That's another distinguisher for them.
But it's funny because I mean I know that there are some of the attack songs that kind of get in your head too. It's like what.
Yeah, my favorite. I mean, Rocky Top's probably my favorite sort of alternative fight song. I mean, Hail to the Victors, all those. I mean, the standard boilerplate top 10, I'm pretty much in agreement with.
And
my favorite alternative
is I have lyrics to Hail to the Victors.
I know you. Yes, exactly. We won't. We're
not talking about them, but I got them.
PG episode. Yeah. Yeah. I think probably, but one of my other two favorite cool but annoying songs / chances, the FSU war chant and USC's tribute to Troy. And I don't know how to describe it to people, but with USC joining the conference, I've told Big Ten fans, you have to go on YouTube and just put tribute to Troy on repeat, because that will give you because truly to desensitize you to the experience you're going to have once the USC marching band shows up in your stadium, because they play it a lot, and it seems like every first down they're playing it. They are. It's very annoying. It's very cool. Like the FSU war chant, when FSU's on the drive, they start playing that, exactly. And it's the first few times you hear it, it's like, oh man, like being on the other side of that is like not fun. But then after a while, it's like, God, they're playing it again. So
shut up.
I will say this. I went to an FSU USC football game in Tallahassee in like 90. And I thought I needed Dramamine at halftime.
Well, I find that and IU now does that with I can't even think of the piece, but we have a piece that kind of goes in that same vein.
Yeah.
But IU, the School of Music, and especially with some of the folks that have come through the IU School of Music, or no, in some cases it's just a law school. Yeah. There's a proud tradition. I mean, I know that it was funny a few years back, and I know we may try and find a way to put this in the show notes too. One of my big crosses I die on is that people know the origin story of Chimes of Indiana. Chimes of Indiana is the alternative alma mater, not the Gloriana Friendship, but da 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 da. That's Chimes of Indiana. A few years back, I'm just sitting around. I think I'm working at my desk and typing in, and I got a YouTube on the back of Hoagie Carmichael. And all of a sudden I hear this song called One Night in Old Havana. And it's Chimes of Indiana with lyrics different, done as a dance tune from like 1931. So I'm going, wait, so Hoagie Carmichael took a song that may have been a B-side that he didn't really sell well. It's not Stardust. It's not Georgia in My Mind. It's not Buttermilk Sky. It's not Lazy River. Okay, I'm going to change the lyrics and give this to my alma mater, and maybe they'll get some run out of it. And they have. It can be used as a wedding processional. It's beautiful. It's a great piece of music, but it's just sometimes it just goes to show that college bands and college programs can tune anything, can really be versatile in so many ways with music.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, on the good and bad side. I mean, I would say, I gave my favorite being Rocky Top.
Yeah.
My least favorite is Maryland. Maryland fight song is literally the MacArthur Park of all college fight songs.
Then everybody plays it. Everybody does a version.
Yeah, I hope not. Yeah, I think it's just strange. There's just nothing to the song really. It's like if you play, and this maybe shows how much, or maybe too much of the college football and college basketball I've taken in over my lifetime. If you played most of the, Power 5 fight songs, I could identify probably almost all of them without an issue, except Maryland, and I've heard it played over and over again. but it's just so there's just nothing to it. It's like if you typed in Chat GBT the boilerplate nouns and verbs for all like fight songs, honor, fight, march, hail, win, all that, and just ask the app to like make a generic fight song and just threw the name Maryland in there. That's I think what the app
What they have done.
The Maryland fight song as is. So yeah, it's yeah, you're right. It's funny how different schools are able to conjure up their own songs like that. I will tell you this last story. You're talking about the Chimes of Indiana. The IU alma mater song. That is what you mentioned, the Gloria Anna, Frangipana, and all that. So I took my wife to her first IU game in the early 2000s, I guess. I think it was like 2006, 2007, somewhere out there. It's the IU versus Northwestern football game. Might have been homecoming. I can't quite remember. And they start playing the IU alma mater song. And my wife in the middle of the song just starts looking at me. After like the first like 3 bars, she just starts like staring daggers like right at me. And I immediately thought, oh God, did I say something? Or
Not this time.
did something wrong here? And so as soon as the song finished, she leans over and whispers, "You stole that." I'm like, what are we talking about? It says, "You stole that from us. How could you call yourself a music school if you steal our music?" And so it turns out, so my wife, she did her undergrad at Cornell in upstate New York. And it turns out Indiana University did swipe their alma mater song from Cornell's Far Above Cayuga's Waters. Now my one defense is
Everybody else
we're not alone.
Everyone else has stolen the alma mater.
Everyone else has stolen that. Exactly. Michigan State, Syracuse, UNC, Bama, Georgia, they've all taken that song and used as their.
There's a preschool in Wichita that uses it. I swear, it's like everybody uses it.
Exactly. The list of people who don't use it is probably
more right, shorter than the ones. Yeah.
Exactly.
So once again, So speaking of music, we want to thank Bob Thompson for it and the sounds you hear on the show. And a special thanks again to John Ringer of rigdesign.com for designing the logo and the look of the show.
Yep. Next episode 14, Bob and I will be interviewing our pal and fellow podcaster, Galen Clavio.
Conversing. It's more of a conversation because what this really is like, this is a late 90s reunion is what this is.
Truly. Yeah. This will truly be going back. We might as well have Blur or Oasis music playing in the background.
I was going to say it would be the 3 of us. We should do it on the balcony of 7th and Washington overlooking the old laundromat.
That would be perfect. Exactly.
He would have been there had we known it. Had we known him at the time. He definitely would have been there.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. He would have been fun addition to our social circle. Definitely.
Oh my gosh.
And
where have you been?
And the topic we'll be discussing at that time will be what happened at the end of the Bob Knight era. So we'll take a look back at the mid 80s to late 90s period at IU when the Bob Knight tenure came to an end and IU and Knight parted ways. So knowing Galen, he will obviously be bringing plenty of receipts to the table. And since he was personally involved in that, and Bob yourself will have plenty of information to share with us from an administrative standpoint, I think people really should tune into this one because you're definitely going to get a little bit of an inside examination of that event from the past.
Let's just put it this way. We have a lot of notes to compare for a very good reason. And it's time to finally go on the record and just make sure everybody knows what we know.
Exactly. It'll be a public service for everybody.
Or the end of my life.
So this endless conversation is brought to you by the Back Home Network. Be sure to check out all the great BHN content, including Assembly Call, Doing the Work, Right at Meridian, The Dribble Drive, and Crimson Cast on YouTube and backhomenetwork.com. So until next time, I'm Mike Weemuth.
And I'm Bob Motes.
Have a good one, everybody. Fight on.
Hail to thee.